Okay, I'm here to talk to you guys about the drugs of the peripheral nervous system. So by this point, we have kind of introduced the peripheral nervous system. You've done some anatomy, physiology review of the peripheral nervous system, and I'm hoping that you're pretty comfortable with the organization as well as the neurons that we find, both pre and post ganglionic neurons, the neurotransmitters that are released in these different setups, and the receptors that they bind. So just a quick review again. Here you see on this picture a different view of the sort of organization of the autonomic nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. On the top there you can see the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic preganglionic neurons exit the central nervous system, and they tend to be really short neurons, and they are going to release acetylcholine, so therefore they're called cholinergic neurons, and again that's the preganglionic. So the preganglionic neuron of the sympathetic nervous system is a cholinergic neuron, and it's going to release, of course, acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter. That acetylcholine is going to bind a nicotinic receptor on the cell body of the postganglionic neuron, which when acetylcholine binds a nicotinic receptor, it actually opens up ion channels, specifically a sodium ion channel. So sodium will rush into that postganglionic neuron, it will depolarize that neuron, bring it to threshold and depolarize it, and then generate an action potential that will be propagated down the length of that postganglionic neuron. So the postganglionic neuron of the sympathetic nervous system is going to release norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter, and that norepi is going to bind all the adrenergic receptors. And the adrenergic receptors, again, are the alphas, the beta 1s, and the beta 2s. So that's the sympathetic nervous system. I think I said this, but that postganglionic neuron is referred to as adrenergic because it releases norepinephrine. The adrenal medulla resembles closely the sympathetic setup in that the neuron that exits the central nervous system and travels to the adrenal medulla. At the adrenal medulla, there's going to be nicotinic receptors. That neuron that exits the central nervous system to stimulate the adrenal medulla is going to release acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter. So that neuron's also considered to be cholinergic. So that acetylcholine is going to bind hit the nicotinic receptors, which will then cause the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine into the blood. So that's going to be a pretty robust response, which is why the fight or flight response is so profound in the body. So epinephrine then, once it's in the blood, can also bind our adrenergic receptors, the alphas, the beta 1s, and the beta 2s at the targets. Just like norepi, epinephrine and norepi bind the same receptors. Then we've got the parasympathetic setup. The preganglionic neuron of the parasympathetic system is cholinergic. It's going to be a longer preganglionic, and it's going to release acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter, which will then bind a nicotinic receptor at the ganglia. That nicotinic receptor, again, is going to open up sodium ion channels, and it's going to allow the big influx of sodium, which should depolarize that neuron, generating an action potential and propagating that action potential to the terminal end of that postganglionic neuron, which is also going to release acetylcholine. So the postganglionic neuron of the parasympathetic nervous system is cholinergic as well. So that acetylcholine then at the targets of the parasympathetic nervous system the acetylcholine is going to bind a muscarinic receptor. And those muscarinic receptor of the parasympathetic nervous system is what produces that sort of rest and digest state, the state that opposes the fight or flight. Of course, these two systems, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, in most cases always are going to oppose one another. And then down at the very bottom, we have the somatic nervous system, which is not autonomic, that's voluntary. And those somatic neurons exit the central nervous system. There's only one. This is not a pre and post ganglionic setup. It's just one long motor neuron that then will synapse at the skeletal muscle. So at the end of that motor neuron, or that somatic neuron, we're going to see the release of acetylcholine. So these neurons are also cholinergic, and the acetylcholine is going to bind a nicotinic receptor, and that's going to cause muscle contraction. So that's kind of the setup. Now that all that stuff, I'd kind of said it fast there because I assume you've been going over it up to this point. That stuff needs to be memorized. No way around that. You've got to have that. So if at this point right now you're still not there, then you need to keep working on it before you dive into the drugs, because the drugs are just going to get confusing. If you know this and you understand the what happens when you have a fight or flight response versus a rest and digest, what happens with sympathetic versus parasympathetic stimulation at the targets, if you get that, then the conversation about the drugs is going to be pretty easy. You can mostly use your common sense and pull on the knowledge that you've been building. But if you're not there yet, then I would not suggest that you keep going into the drugs. I would suggest that you rewind and keep at it until this is really familiar. If this is familiar, then we're going to keep on going, right? So here's a little summary of the types of autonomic receptors. They're broken down. We've kind of gone through these. So basically how this is set up here on the top, we've got our acetylcholine and the two receptor types that acetylcholine can bind, muscarinic at the parasympathetic targets, also at the electrical conduction system of the heart. And what we see here is the stimulation when acetylcholine binds muscarinic receptors. If for the targets, we're thinking of, again, the cardiac, the heart, specifically here, the really what's mostly under the control of the parasympathetic nervous system is the rate of the heart. And then the smooth muscle of all hollow organs, so your gut, your genitourinary system, your entire gastrointestinal system, etc. So what we'd expect to see with the muscarinic receptors binding acetylcholine at the targets, we'd expect to see stimulation of the smooth muscle of all hollow organs, also the increase in exocrine secretions, and a decrease in heart rate. Decrease in contraction is really minimal. Actually, I should put that in italics because that's not a real profound effect of the parasympathetic nervous system, but definitely a decrease in the rate of the heart. Then we go to the nicotinic receptor. So we know that we've got the nicotinic receptors at all of our ganglia, also at the adrenal medulla, and at the neuromuscular junction. So drugs that are going to stimulate or inhibit nicotinic receptors are not going to be very useful to us because they have such a broad effect. And in many cases, they potentially oppose one another. But if you need to get to the skeletal muscle and you need to use a peripheral nervous system or an autonomic nervous system to do it, then that's your only option. And so you can see over there that when acetylcholine binds a nicotinic receptor at the neuromuscular junction, you'd see an increase in skeletal muscle contraction. And other than that, you're going to potentially see sympathetic and or parasympathetic effects because of the situation at the ganglia. So for that reason, they're not really desirable. Okay, so now we have norepinephrine hitting our adrenergic receptors, and the options here are alpha 1s, alpha 2s, beta 1s, beta 2s. For our class up at this point, we're not really going to focus on the alpha 2s. They're sort of different. We're going to talk about those in the central nervous system section just briefly. So now I'm just really going to focus on the alpha 1s. Alpha 1s are the adrenergic receptors at our targets, with the exception of the heart, so the hollow organs, also the eye. So we see the big effects of hitting these alpha receptors. The alpha receptors are where we have control over the vasculature. The vasculature, if you recall, meaning that only the sympathetic nervous system exerts an effect. So when norepinephrine binds these alpha 1 receptors, you would expect to see definitely pronounced vasoconstriction, and that of course would increase the blood pressure. And then the other thing about alpha receptors is that we do have alpha receptors in the eye, and those are the receptors that are responsible for dilating the pupils. The receptors are found in the radial muscle of the eye. I'm going to skip over the alpha 2s right now and go to the beta 1s, which are notably found in the heart. We always think of beta 1 only in the heart and also in the kidneys. The kidneys are also another area that are, in terms of the autonomic nervous system, that are not dually innervated. And so we absolutely know that when norepinephrine hits beta 1 receptors in the heart, we're going to see both an increase in contraction, because the electrical system is definitely innervated by the sympathetic nervous system, but also the force of contraction, because like myocardium itself has beta 1 receptors. And then the other thing that we're going to expect to see with the release of norepinephrine binding these beta 1 receptors in the kidney is an activation of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Renin will be released, and if you remember, traditionally in terms of normal physiology, the release of renin is generally secondary to a decrease in blood pressure. But in this case, this is a sympathetic stimulation that's causing the renin to be released. And when renin is released, it sets off a series of reactions that ultimately leads to pretty profound vasoconstriction as well as water reabsorption. So we would expect this to have an effect that would increase blood pressure in and we're going to kind of circle back around in the cardiovascular unit and talk a little bit more about that. And then finally, the beta 2 receptors, those are our adrenergic receptors that we think of as our targets, which are outside of the heart, so the smooth muscle of hollow stuff, and also our exocrine glands. So these are going to produce, when norepinephrine is present and it stimulates these beta 2 receptors, the reaction is going to be that of opposition of the parasympathetic nervous system. So you would expect to see an inhibition of the smooth muscle in all of our hollow organs. And but I guess that's it. That's all I wanted to say about that. The beta 2s traditionally don't affect the heart. One place that we think a lot about beta 2 receptors is the airway, so we'll kind of come back to that, and also kind of overall body metabolism, as well. All right, so this is how we're going to kind of break these drugs down, and I'm going to do them all kind of separately. These are classified, the drugs themselves are classified by the receptors they either stimulate or block, either directly or indirectly. So the drugs that stimulate the sympathetic nervous system are oftentimes referred to as sympathomimetics, and that means to mimic the sympathetic nervous system, or adrenergic agonist. And remember, an agonist is something that's stimulatory, that sort of turns on a receptor. So those are the ones that stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. I'm going to skip and talk here about the inhibitors of the sympathetic nervous system. Those would be called sympatholytics, to lyse or to cut the action of the sympathetic nervous system, or adrenergic antagonists or blockers. Then we're going to have our parasympathetic drugs. So those that stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system are going to be referred to as parasympathomimetics, or parasympathetic agonists, or muscarinic agonists are probably the best way to talk about these drugs. And those that block sometimes are called anticholinergics, or parasympatholytics, or muscarinic blockers or muscarinic antagonists. So there's a lot of terminology. Again, that's where knowing these words really comes in handy, because they are used frequently and interchangeably. And so you want to not get thrown off by any of those different terms. All right, so for each of the drugs that we're going to talk about in the individual videos, we are going to talk about, I'll put them up here all in order. We're going to talk about pharmacotherapeutics, why we'd use these drugs clinically. Oftentimes, we use the term indications in this context. Then pharmacokinetics, how they are absorbed, distributed, metabolized, and excreted. We're not going to talk a lot about that, but a little bit of that. We will talk a little bit about pharmacodynamics, and that's how the drug is working, or the drug's mechanism of action, sometimes biochemically, but more oftentimes more on a broader perspective in a physiological sense. And then if there are the known toxic effects of the drugs, we'll talk about those as well. So what we're going to do is kind of come back in the next video, and we're going to start with the cholinergic drugs. So I will pick it up there. And remember, if at this point you're not feeling comfortable with the organization, don't keep going, because it's just going to get confusing. Spend a little bit more time trying to get the lay of the land, and that will make the rest of it quite a bit easier.